Good morning, and thank you all of you for coming, and thank you to the Resilience Center for inviting me, and for Svetbayo and Maria as well for this kind of opportunity to be here. I just want to share with you some of the talks that we are giving to our national biodiversity policy that has recently been adjusted in Colombia, and how the ideas of resilience, adaptive thinking are being incorporated at least into the wording of the policy, because you know that it takes a long time and a long way to move from one conceptual framework to another type of approach for any kind of policy. So I'm going to show a bit of the thoughts that we discussed during the last 3 years within the Ministry of Environment and the Academy and all the institutes of research in Colombia. And probably the title is too big for the real things that I can present to you, but I'll try to show what is going on in Colombia right now, and then if you have some questions, and I'd be glad to take them. So first of all, I just want to translate what the parrots are saying. Is that when any politician is asked what should we do about the environment, it's sustainable development. That's the buzzword that has plagued our work in environmental sciences during the last at least 20 years. It is still a very interesting concept, but it's growing meaningless because of it has not been translated to operational ideas or projects. Well, I want to start by showing you a short case, a short story from Colombia. This picture is from the lower Magdalena River, which is tropical, probably our most important river in history, that goes from the center of the country to the Caribbean Sea. And it also forms a huge wetland in the middle, which you can see behind the coast of the river. So there's a huge amount of lakes and lagoons, and a very tropical environment. In this type of environment, one of the most cherished naturalists from Sweden and Colombia did an impressive work almost 100 years ago. By the beginning of the 20th century, George Dahl went to Colombia to study nature, and he published a couple of books. One was the first catalog of the fishes of the river Magdalena, which is still a classic, in 1971. And I think the best naturalist description of what is life in tropical Colombia, which is called jaguar, because of the big cat. That was published in 1939 when Professor Dahl, which I don't know if he's still alive. I think he passed away some years ago, but it's impossible to find information about his bio anywhere. So I think that we need to dedicate some thoughts to his life. But he went onto the forest and lived with the Embera indigenous groups for at least 6 months, and then he wrote the book Jaguar to report about the views of the world of the Embera people that see the forest with the eyes of the jaguar. And he described it very carefully, the species of the forest, because he was a good botanist, the birds, the mammals. It's a huge book, plenty of descriptions of nature, but then he moves towards people and explains how the Embera people lives in the San Jorge River, which is a part of this basin, and takes half of the book to explain the social issues of the livelihoods and whereabouts of Embera people. So it's a great book about social and ecological dimensions of life in Colombia. It's built in 1939. So it's quite visionary for the issues that we are talking nowadays about ecosystem management and socio-ecological approaches. This probably is an old story that you may know, that in many places of Latin America, rigid fields were very common, and were the way that native people used to modify the landscapes, the flooded landscapes, and to manage the huge amounts of rainfall that we got during the rainy season, between 4,000, 5,000, even 10,000 millimeters a year. So the flooding was used for creating a very productive landscape, plenty of wildlife uses, plenty of plants that were domesticated in that environment, and you see up in that picture the way that those ridges worked, and that was a very interesting adaptation for such ecological conditions. And then we had millions of people, really we are talking about millions of people living with that strategy, from the south of the United States to the northern part of Argentina. So it's one of the most spread ecological adaptations and cultural settings in the tropics. However, this adaptation was completely destroyed when the Spanish come to Americas in the 15th century, and afterwards it never came back. But still there are some peasants, some indigenous groups in very, very far away places that still do practice that type of production, combining fisheries with agriculture, wildlife use, and it seems that it should be the basis for a sustainable way of life in that kind of environments. But it's the contrary, that nowadays the flooded plains are seen as a problem for development, and usually the idea of adaptation to that kind of environment is not used, and the strategy is to drain them and to build plenty of say diques, dams, and and to desiccate all the flooded land. And then we have, when there's lots of rains coming and there's lots of erosion that fills with sand and silt the river, we have huge floodings like last year, with hundreds of thousands of people having to move towards cities, and lots of crops lost. So, and you see there's a road that was built on the side of the river that was destroyed. But then we got again money for rebuilding the same the same roads and the same infrastructure, because there's a political problem that has to be solved very quickly. So you have to get money from the government, emergency issues, and you start again until the next flooding. And that's a kind of pathology for environmental management that we have been unable to break. It's repeating every 4 years, every 5 years, and it got synchronized with the political campaigns, and that the politicians use that type of natural behavior to get votes, because they send money to relieve the population, and there's mispractice that it's based on the flooding and people displacement. So, and it's good for the economy as well, because you move money, you get to renew structure, but it's kind of crazy, that kind of misadaptation. And that's quite the same that we are talking about when analyzing socio-ecological issues and adaptive management. We can run on a regime that it's not sustainable, and it's very difficult to break. That's the bad side of resilience. But in sociology, and during the 50s, the first school of sociological thinking in Colombia already described that issue, and Dr. Falsborda, which is quite famous, at least in Latin America, wrote a book in the 70s, which is the double history of the coast. And he meant by double that there's a history that was made from people, the history of the local people, and how they frame their own lives within the cycle of rains and the cycle of fish movement in the river, and how they frame their own way of life, and they explain their own adaptations to that environment and how their culture was expressed. And then there's the other history, which is the official history of development, and how the river should be changed, and how the nature should be controlled, and how society should be taught to live in that kind of developed environment. And I wanted to raise that question and the work of Orlando Falsborda, because he was also one of the first to think that the social organizations, the local organizations and local cultures had lots to do with the ecological cycles, and that was truly interdependence between nature and culture. And he described the same for many other environments in Colombia, high Andean peasants culture and else. So during the last, and I'm coming to present, Colombia made an environmental policy like any other country, because we signed the CBD Convention, and we have a biodiversity policy, and that was accepted, that was part of the national policies made part of the national policies in 1996. And the evidence is that this policy is not working well. It's not getting results, it's not getting impact, despite all the advancements in science and in the way we are trying to manage biodiversity. So we gave, under the direction of the Minister of Environment and some universities, a revision of that policy. And during that revision on the effects of policy, we used the frame of the resilience theory to see if we could make some adjustments to that policy based on the ideas that many scholars were talking about during from the years from the 70s to 2000. And those are some of the issues that we discussed during these 3 years, until the policy, a new policy was adopted a couple of months ago, which is focusing and is recommending a different approach to biodiversity and ecosystem services management, an approach that is based on the ideas of adaptation and learning, social learning to the changes and resilience thinking. And so the interesting or the important thing is to see how resilience thinking is being developed in Colombia? How are we using those ideas? And if there were particular any particular relation with the way Colombians have talked on environment in previous times. Some very clear pathologies that we identified during this period of time, and I choose 3 of them. We call the media effect, the political effectiveness effect, the shield effect. That's just wording for saying that our minds have shifted lots from the ideas of nature in the 70s, in the 80s, to the ideas of today about nature and nature in the tropics, because there's a huge movement of people from the countryside to the cities, and now we have the first generation that has already been born and raised in cities without a clear reference to nature or to wild environments, and that have been raised with TV shows and Natural Geographic and Discovery Channel and whatever ideas of nature, and they have become very conscious of nature, quote unquote, but they devote to animal protection and animal rights, and so they understand ecology as the rights of dogs and cats in the cities and birds, and they are expanding this view to the countryside, to stop hunting, to stop wild animal use, and then to change the ethics of the population, which very bad effect on the management of biodiversity, because it's a resource. It's widely used by local people, and we are having already conflicts between local people that are trying to keep their ways of life with urban people that has a different view of animal rights or what have to be done with them. Political effectiveness is how politicians see the way of managing biodiversity. That people is asking for results, so they are preparing laws, very strong laws, and creating massive locks for action, because the law is general for the country, and diversity is not included, and it's very difficult to embed the differences, the variability of conditions in one law. So, but at least it's a law that deals with water protection standards, ecosystem conservation, but has very different effects throughout the territory. And with a strong law, there's a strong transaction costs. There's lots of needs for good administration, and since we cannot enforce many of those laws, there's plenty of corruption. So environmental management has become a source of corruption, very widely known, and a problem in Colombia as well as in many other countries. And finally, the shield effect. If you have read the papers those days, you have learned that some Italian geologist has been convicted for not being able to predict a quake, or at least for compromising their science with politics and mixing the fields in a way that they have to take responsibility for what they said. But what we are seeing is that politicians are shifting, are sending their responsibility to science for those things that are not predictable, for uncertainty, and asking scientists to be clever about what is going to happen. And if science accepts that has the power to predict everything, there's going to be trouble. We are going to lose credibility, we are getting in problems, and this is a clash between politicians and scientists that we have to solve quickly, and we are in trouble every day in this situation. Well, some of the issues that were used to discuss the idea of social ecological ruptures in Colombia and how should we put them again together, had to deal with the idea of ecology and culture, or at least ecosystem. For many Colombians, the idea of ecosystem is of a wild ecosystem, and biodiversity is something that happens far away from the cities or from their places of life. So nobody will say that this is an ecosystem or that has ecological roots. This is a peasant landscape, it's a bamboo forest. Well, forest is a small piece of a bamboo plot with coffee in the surroundings and plantains and some grass. But this is not an ecosystem for anybody. It's very difficult for us to think on that as an ecosystem. But it is. It is. And we have to convince people that there's ecology going on there. And there are nutrient cycling, there are water processes, that there are functions that are running under the soil and the air, etc., etc. And it's even worse for big producers that are buying land for biofuels, by example. They are trying to expand their production, and then when they are told that they have to have ecosystem management plan, they say, no, but I didn't buy ecosystems. I buy land. I bought land for production, but if I knew I was buying ecosystem, probably I would change my mind. Then this rupture is translated as well in management. And those are the words that are used in the CBD treaty and translated to the 1996 policy that asked us to do research, to do conservation, and to do sustainable use. Those are the three axes of the policy from the CBD. But when you split the ecosystem in one side and the society in the other, you get that kind of result. The size of the world is kind of proportion of what happened during the last 10 years in Colombia and in many other countries. That knowledge has grown a bit, mostly scientific knowledge, but not as much as we need, of course. But other types of knowledge have been denied. They're kind of the folk knowledge is nice, and we can talk about it, the traditional knowledge, but it's not useful for decision making. Then we got a huge chunk of interest in conservation, but conservation we mean protected areas, to declaring national parks. This is fancy, it's very important, but you cannot say that by protecting 10% of your territory you are protecting biodiversity and a wide scope of life in the country. It's outside protected areas. So other conservation strategies such as managed landscapes or urban conservation have been denied. And the other issues, threatened species strategies. So we use 10, 20 fancy and nice species, and you put all the money on in the case of Colombia, crocodiles, eagles, condor, or whatever, and that's conservation. And finally, sustainable use in the convention was equal to bioprospecting. We managed to destroy our own capacity of bioprospecting with a law that forbids bioprospecting without lots of paperwork. And so we cannot do any kind of genetic prospecting or promoting the use of biodiversity. So we are not doing sustainable use at all. But very small work with food security and ecosystem services. That's something that is growing. But finally, very teeny, I don't know if you can read it, equity. Nobody is really interested in equity and or doing a good job with equity. And probably the cause for such a rupture between an ecological view and a social or cultural view of issues, or an integrated view, is, as many of you are working with, the complexity of those relations that are not linear. There's plenty of different connections that are formed in each system and within themselves. And we also have some people that have given a talk on complexity in Colombia. Julio Carrizosa Umaña wrote a book in 2003 which is called Colombia from the Imaginary, I had trouble translating it, the imaginary to the complex. Trying to say that we live in a fairy tale in Colombia, which is very quote unquote, it's an ugly tale of denial, that we are not living in our own territory, and that we are imagining a kind of country that does not exist, and that we still think that we are living probably in Castilla, in Spain, or somewhere else, but we do not own to our land, or we don't have strong ties with the ecological way of the ecological functioning of the land. And then he said that this is, you can see that on the territorial asymmetries in Colombia, where most of the people lives on the mountains, on the higher parts, because of probably of the climate, because they are more alike other ecological settings and production systems, and daily life is not that tropical that should be as it should be. And he is proposing to build new cities in Colombia, to move people away from the Andean realm to lowlands and teach them to live in the ecosystem, which is a kind of interesting idea, such as that in Brazil, but that didn't work very well because it was a planet city. But he is promoting that idea that we should move people, huge amounts of people, and to build more symmetric population all throughout the country. And those asymmetries are real. This is a map of Colombia for those of you that don't know. On the left side is the ecological accumulated footprint, being purple the lower, being red the highest footprint, and so on those lines are the 500 meter level of the sea level, the altitude. And so the highest footprint is on the highest part of the Andes, and in the Caribbean zone. On the right side you have the forest, non-forest map, which shows that still in Colombia we have at least 50% of the territory with forest cover, mostly located in the Amazon, which is all this part, most in the Pacific coast, and some in the central Magdalena River. But this is also a wild landscape, there are natural savannas. So we can say that at least more than 55% of the country still has or retains very wild ecosystems or natural ecosystems. I don't like to use that word, but that's it. But there's lots of people living in those forests. This is the map for indigenous common lands. More than 80 different indigenous groups live in Colombia, and they own more than 30% of the country. That means a huge cultural diversity, comparable to that of Mexico or that of India. But in the case of Colombia, each ethnic minority has its own chunk of land, They own the land. They cannot sell it. They cannot negotiate with it, but they own the land, and they keep more or less their tradition. So this is part of a very important part of what we think about nature and how we should incorporate other views of nature in our country to do biodiversity management. Some pictures of that diversity. And when I said ethnic minorities this is real, there are less than 2% of the total population, and at least half of those ethnic minorities are almost going to extinction. 500 people, 1,000 people. So they are declared in emergency by the United Nations. And the Pacific coast as well is covered by forest, but it's plenty of black communities' common lands, which were granted in 1991, and they also have the same kind of rights than the indigenous peoples to the forest, and they have their own traditions, some of them coming even from Africa, and they gained the right to manage those lands with lots of political struggle during the past century, and nowadays they are doing management plans for their territories. And so that's the rest of the country. The rest of the country, which is being used such as for growing coffee, our most cherished product. But we are not doing well with coffee. Coffee is going down, the production is going down, even though the total cultivated area is going up. So there's something happening with coffee crops in Colombia, probably due to climate change, the competition with Vietnam, plenty of issues. But you see the spots, the yellow spots on the map are the coffee growing zone, which has replaced almost 100% of montane forest. So that type of ecosystem had a regime shift almost a century ago and was changed. The forest was changed for coffee. And then we have another type of social ecological setting. Then we have, sadly, coca crops. And this is one of the maps of coca crops in Colombia. 80,000 hectares, more or less, the last year. Mining as well, not just mining is being done in indigenous lands as well as black communities' lands, and everywhere is mining. And so complexity ends with the idea that everybody has a different map, a different idea of what is Colombia. Every ministry, every development plan, every regional plan has a different and very different way of thinking about Colombia and about the land. I don't know if this happens the same everywhere, and that difference is growing because of fragmentation of disciplines, fragmentations of policies. But there's mining projections. In red, there are mining concessions, oil prospection. Every sector has its own country to handle. And still we have other troubles such as conflict. We started another round of peace talks yesterday, but we have troubles with mines. And for biodiversity research, that's an issue. There's very difficult. There are many places that you cannot go safely to do research. Unfortunately, also human displacement. At least it says almost 2 million people displaced, people expelled, people from their lands during the last 6 years, probably amounting 3 million according unofficial numbers. And that's huge amounts of people's movement all across the country. And also climate variability, which amounts to that complexity. So I have this picture to see, well, really, so who's in charge in the country? And who's in charge of environmental policy? Can you do anything? Can you talk about doing environmental policy with all these scenarios? And I won't say which part of the man's picture is the environment policy. And if there's kind of environmental sector, somebody who has to protect or to handle biodiversity and ecosystem services against all the other forces, that do we have as environmentalists a particular map and that we are trying to impose or to negotiate with the others? Well, the question is, why has not collapsed the country while other countries are not doing so well? It's incredible. We think that we live in a quite chaotic reality. The happiest country of the world, according our own some measures of, let's say, we are all happy. We live very happily in Colombia. 4 million displaced, mining, war, but the economy is growing, it's doing well. We are one of the 10 most unequal economies in the world. We are almost developed. We are going to the OECD, so it's just on the verge of being developed. And I found this interesting, the adaptive complex cycle with ants. So one of our hypotheses is that biodiversity is behind the avoidance of collapse. That really it's the living energy, would say, of the country that is behind that scenario, and that we are not. Still, we do not understand how, but the ability to recover from perturbation, which is in the core of ecosystem dynamics, is helping us very much. And the huge amounts of biodiversity we have are the real force for sustaining our development. And if we don't realize that, if we don't incorporate that in our development in the next 10 or 20 years, probably we'll get to the threshold that we want to avoid. Probably we'll get plenty of regions will go to worse situation because of flooding, because of natural disasters, because of whatever. But if you tell people, this was, well. If you tell people that, they will say, no. On the contrary, there's too much biodiversity. So 1,700 types of birds, 15% of the birds of the world live in Colombia. So the question is, can we spare some? Why don't we, well, we can exchange 500 species for a bit of development. And this is something that is, nobody wants to talk about. I mentioned yesterday in the other seminar, because it's ugly, it's not correct. But that's why people is thinking, can we spare some ecosystems? Some rivers are too much. So for building dams, okay, let's spoil here, and then we'll still have plenty of the Amazon. And that's a risk in the political arena, because the Amazonia is seen as a conservation place. All our efforts and money is going to the Amazon, and we'll save the Amazon. There's very few people there. There's mining probably, but we can save the Amazon, but the rest of the country is for development. And we have that kind of idea. It's very, very under our cultural framing. And so finally, the facts that are behind the discussion are still the same than were framed by the Resilience Center, the resilience theory some years ago, that unless we are able to connect the ecosystem functioning, the ecosystem, the biodiversity and the ecosystem services with human well-being and with our cultural constructions, we are not going to be able to get over the next years. And so that's the basis. And finally, this was the introduction to the policy, the words that we frame on the first page. So, and this is the policy. It's a document that I got it translated today, finally, officially translated. So for those of you who want to take a look on the policy, it was adopted, as I said, a couple of months ago by the minister. And we hope that talking about biodiversity management, we would be able to get everybody into the discussion of what have to we do with biodiversity and ecosystem services. What kind of country should we imagine with such amount of richness and biodiversity? So the conceptual framework of the policy, it's explicit about adopting resilience theory, adopting general view of adaptive management and learning. And so after that, the policy framed the new strategies for biodiversity and ecosystem service management under the CBD guidance, but because we have to do that. Those are the 6 axes of the policy that should be implemented in the next few years. Those axes were defined by the ministry, and those axes were also linked to the Aichi goals from the CBD and with the Sustainable Development Targets or goals that Colombia proposed to the Rio Convention that still are just words. So this is a challenge that we have, and a challenge that needs a research agenda, which I won't talk now because time is over, but an agenda of research which its purpose is to put together again our cultural views with our ways of life in the territory. We have to prove that human well-being in Colombian society is really linked to biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services. And how? Well, there's kind of the same agenda that that is being developed in many other countries, and here in the Stockholm Resilience Center there's plenty of research guidance, and I had some slides for doing what kind of research are we doing now in Colombia to address those challenges. I won't go into that. But many of those had to do explicitly with the description of the situation that I made in the first part of the lecture, to counteract all those lacks of those gaps on knowledge and problems. So we are doing a lot with other sectors such as agriculture, trying to convince them that ecosystem services management is part of stewardship of agriculture. With the oil companies, the national oil company, we have been working the last 2 years and a half, and we expect to keep working with them for a long time in order to create safeguards within the company for biodiversity. We are doing lots of efforts on communication, and communication from the scientist point of view. We're trying to build a project for citizen science and participatory monitoring of biodiversity, and to put lots of people working with Colombian biodiversity, but also to recover the traditional knowledge and other ways of seeing the territory, because there are plenty of richness. It's 3,000 years of tradition and experiences embedded on the oral narratives. And finally, an idea that many of our colleagues doesn't like very much is that there are new ecosystems emerging, that probably we are getting to new domains of stability that probably are, it's an optimistic message that there could be some arrangements, but we don't know. That's what Alien going out. The final remarks. So, like in our countries, assessing and managing resilience remains a challenge, but we are at least discussing, and it's being useful for opening and inviting other people to the discussion about biodiversity management. It's not a business of scientists, it is not a business of conservation community. It's something that we all have to care. And the question behind is that if biodiversity is the real asset of Colombia, and it's behind its well-being, the social well-being. So we have the policy, but you know that there's nothing more resilient than rhetorics. So hopefully we'll be able to break the words and words and words and do some. Well, I didn't give a word of governance, which was on the title, because governance, it's all the different ways that Colombians or any other people have to discuss and decide what to do with biodiversity. And this is not really being discussed on the proper scales, with the proper intensity. So we have to build governance with all these within all this frame. And so thank you very much.